27 seconds of suspense in the turbulent South China Sea. In an attempt to corner a much smaller Philippine patrol vessel, two massive Chinese Coast Guard ships slammed into each other, creating a scene of chaos and humiliation. But this was not the end. The embarrassing incident was merely the first spark, igniting a tense superpower standoff where a single miscalculation could push the entire region to the brink of war. The South China Sea, one of the most contested waters on Earth, suddenly erupted into chaos. Near Panatag Shoal, known internationally as Scarborough Shoal, two Chinese Coast Guard vessels collided in a reckless maneuver while chasing a much smaller Philippine patrol ship. It began as a routine harassment mission. The BRP Suluan, a modest Philippine Coast Guard vessel, was conducting lawful patrols just 45 nautical miles from the shoal. For years, Filipino crews have braved Chinese intimidation in these waters. But on this morning, Beijing decided to push harder. A massive China Coast Guard cutter, hull number 3104, accelerated dangerously to block the Philippine ship's course. Its wake churned white water across the shoal as it swerved within just 50 meters of the Suluan. What happened next shocked everyone watching. A second Chinese vessel, attempting to flank the Philippine ship, misjudged its speed. Steel slammed against steel. The sickening crunch of hull plates buckling echoed across the waves. The two Chinese ships, both over 200 tons, locked together for several seconds before peeling apart, smoke rising from twisted metal. In the chaos, at least 4 Chinese sailors were thrown overboard. Desperate shouts crackled over the radio. Life rings were tossed, but the current dragged them quickly out of reach. Within minutes, search crews reported personnel missing, presumed lost. What was supposed to be a show of dominance had turned into a humiliating disaster. For Beijing, the optics were catastrophic. Instead of forcing the Philippine vessel to retreat, China's own ships had collided in full view of international observers. The BRP Suluan calmly altered course and continued its patrol, untouched. Philippine officers later described it as the moment arrogance met reality. But make no mistake, this was not just an accident at sea. Analysts immediately recognized the political stakes. A collision between Chinese ships, while attempting to intimidate a smaller neighbor, exposed the recklessness of Beijing's so-called exclusion zone enforcement. For Washington, it was proof that Chinese aggression was not only unlawful, it was dangerously incompetent. By that evening, reports confirmed the collision had taken place less than 120 nautical miles from Philippine shores, well within Manila's exclusive economic zone under the 2016 Hague ruling. The incident quickly circulated across global news networks. Headlines read, "Chinese aggression backfires. Ships collide in South China Sea." For China, the question was clear: how to respond. For the Philippines, the message was equally clear: they would not be bullied out of their own waters. And for the United States, watching closely from afar, the opportunity had arrived. This was only the beginning. June 24th, 2025, 07 to 15 a.m. Beijing time. The morning after the humiliating collision, China moved fast to rewrite the story. Official state media described it as a routine maritime incident and blamed the Philippines for provocative maneuvers. But reality told a different tale. From Hainan Island, the China Coast Guard dispatched a search and rescue flotilla, 1 large cutter and 8 armed maritime militia vessels disguised as fishing boats. On paper, their mission was humanitarian: recover missing personnel. But anyone watching the satellite imagery could see the truth. This was not a rescue mission. It was a show of dominance. By mid-morning, 5 additional CCG ships arrived near Panatag Shoal, joined by 14 militia vessels. They fanned out in tight formation, effectively locking down the area. To the untrained eye, it looked like a massive rescue sweep. To military analysts, it was unmistakable. Beijing was turning a mistake into an excuse for escalation. On board the Philippine BRP Teresa Magbanua, which was stationed 50 nautical miles away, officers reported heavy Chinese activity. Radars lit up with militia contacts swarming like ants around the shoal. Fishermen who had worked these waters for generations were suddenly ordered away by booming loudspeakers in Mandarin. "This is Chinese territory. Leave immediately." The Philippines wasn't fooled. Commodore J. Tariella of the Philippine Coast Guard went on record, stating, "China is using the pretext of search operations to tighten its grip. This is not rescue. This is occupation." Behind the scenes, the People's Liberation Army Navy also made its presence felt. 2 PLA Navy frigates moved into shadowing positions just beyond the shoal, their radars sweeping the horizon. Overhead, Chinese J-15 fighters conducted low passes, sending a clear message. The skies were theirs, or so they claimed. But even as Beijing flexed, cracks were visible. Reports leaked that the missing sailors had not been recovered. Families back home demanded answers. Social media in China censored footage of the collision, but blurry videos had already circulated internationally. The image of 2 Chinese ships slamming into each other could not be erased. Meanwhile, diplomats in Manila scrambled. Calls went out to Washington, Tokyo, and Canberra, warning that the situation was deteriorating. International news networks now carried live satellite shots of the shoal, showing a dense cluster of Chinese vessels, dozens of AIS transponders blinking red on maritime trackers. The message from Beijing was unmistakable. They would not admit weakness. Instead, they would double down, expand their footprint, and hope the world believed the narrative of a rescue. But America was already watching. And within 24 hours, the United States Navy would answer Beijing's bluff in a way no one could ignore. June 25th, 2025, 08:20 a.m. local time. The morning sun glared across the South China Sea as a new silhouette appeared on the horizon. It wasn't Chinese, it wasn't Philippine, it was American. The guided missile destroyer USS Higgins, DDG-76, and the littoral combat ship USS Cincinnati, LCS-20, sailed just 30 nautical miles from Panatag Shoal, their radar domes gleaming in the heat. This was no accident. Washington had made its decision overnight. Respond to Beijing's dangerous escalation with an unmistakable show of force. The 2 ships began freedom of navigation operations, phone ops, on a deliberate course through contested waters. Every maneuver was textbook, transparent, predictable, professional. The United States was sending a message the world could read loud and clear. At 8:45 a.m., Chinese state media announced that foreign warships had illegally entered Chinese waters. Loudspeakers from Chinese Coast Guard vessels broadcast warnings in Mandarin. "Leave immediately. You are violating Chinese sovereignty." The American response was silence. Their bridge crews carried on, eyes fixed on radar screens, confident in the law and in their steel hulls. Behind that steel was immense firepower. The Higgins, an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer, carried 90 vertical launch cells loaded with SM-2s, Tomahawks, and anti-submarine rockets. The Cincinnati, smaller but agile, brought modern surveillance systems and anti-ship missiles together. They formed a spearhead no Chinese militia vessel could match. By 09:12 a.m., Chinese formations shifted. 5 Coast Guard cutters and a swarm of militia ships tightened their ring, shadowing the Americans at less than 3 nautical miles. Overhead, radar operators on the Higgins picked up multiple J-15 fighter jets lifting from a Chinese airstrip on Hainan Island. Within 40 minutes, those jets would be on station. In Manila, the news broke instantly. Philippine officials confirmed the U.S. deployment, emphasizing that operations were fully consistent with international maritime law. Crowds gathered outside the U.S. Embassy, waving both Philippine and American flags. For a nation long bullied at sea, the sight of U.S. warships standing firm was more than symbolic. It was reassurance. Back in Washington, the Pentagon's press secretary delivered a sharp statement. The United States Navy will continue to fly, sail, and operate wherever international law allows. Intimidation has no place in the South China Sea. But inside Beijing's command centers, alarms were flashing. What began as an internal embarrassment had escalated into an international showdown. The presence of 2 U.S. warships meant that every Chinese move was now under a microscope. One wrong decision, one reckless pilot, and the South China Sea could ignite. As the clock ticked past noon, the stage was set. Chinese ships on one side, American warships on the other, and the Philippines caught in the middle. The world held its breath. The standoff had officially begun. June 26, 2025, 14:10 local time. The South China Sea was boiling, not with waves, but with warships, aircraft, and tension so thick it could snap at any second. By mid-afternoon, radar operators aboard the USS Higgins reported multiple Chinese J-15 fighter jets entering the area. Their transponders were dark, their formations tight. Within minutes, 2 of them dropped altitude, screaming past the American destroyer at barely 500 feet. Pilots aboard the American ship watched as the Chinese jets banked dangerously close, less than 200 feet vertical separation from a Philippine Coast Guard aircraft already on station. It was a deliberate act of intimidation. On the surface, things looked no less dangerous. Chinese Coast Guard cutters boxed the USS Cincinnati on 3 sides, their loudspeakers blaring, "You are entering Chinese waters! Leave immediately!" But the American crew stood firm. The ship's engines hummed at steady speed, maintaining its lawful course. Inside the Higgins Combat Information Center, red lights glowed. Operators tracked more than 40 separate contacts. Chinese militia vessels, Coast Guard cutters, PLA Navy frigates, all closing the distance. At one point, a Chinese cutter crossed within 1.5 nautical miles of the American destroyer, an action naval analysts later described as a breath away from disaster. In Manila, the tension was palpable. Philippine officials confirmed their ships were still shadowing the shoal, maintaining distance but refusing to withdraw. "We are not leaving," Commodore J. Tariela told reporters. "This is Philippine territory under international law." Back at Panatag Shoal, ordinary Filipino fishermen were caught in the middle. Their radios crackled with warnings, their small boats dwarfed by the steel walls of foreign warships. To them, the sea that once fed their families had turned into a battlefield. But it was the air that carried the greatest risk. At 14:42, American radar picked up a Chinese J-15, locking its fire control radar onto a Philippine surveillance aircraft. For 27 tense seconds, it was the electromagnetic equivalent of pointing a loaded gun. The Philippine pilot kept his course, refusing to be intimidated, until the Chinese jet finally broke lock. But the message was clear: one wrong move, and the skies above Panatag could explode in seconds. Meanwhile, on the bridge of the USS Higgins, Captain James R. Hayes gave calm orders. "Maintain formation, hold your course, document everything." The professionalism of the U.S. Navy stood in stark contrast to the recklessness of Chinese maneuvers. Every radar ping, every aggressive pass, every dangerous approach was logged, time-stamped, and transmitted in real time to the Pentagon. International media called it the most dangerous standoff in the South China Sea since 2012. Experts warned that the margin for error had shrunk to zero. As the sun set over Panatag Shoal, the world knew one thing. The standoff was no longer just about fishing grounds or patrol routes. It was about who truly controlled the Pacific. The next day, the consequences would echo far beyond the South China Sea. June 27, 2025, 09 a.m. local time. The dawn broke over Panatag Shoal, but the waters were anything but calm. By now, the standoff had grown into an international crisis, with the eyes of the world fixed on a small reef in the South China Sea. Satellite imagery released overnight showed the scale of the confrontation. More than 25 Chinese vessels, 2 U.S. warships, multiple Philippine patrol boats, and dozens of aircraft crisscrossing the skies. Every move was tracked by global media, every radar contact analyzed by military experts from Washington to Tokyo. The collision of 2 Chinese ships just 4 days earlier had ignited something far greater, a battle for credibility in the Pacific. The Philippines stood firm. Their largest Coast Guard vessel, the BRP Teresa Magbanua, remained on station 50 nautical miles from the shoal. Fishermen, once driven out by Chinese intimidation, now sailed under the protection of both Philippine and American forces. Manila's message was simple. This is our EEZ. We will not surrender it. The United States amplified that message. The Pentagon confirmed that the USS Higgins and USS Cincinnati would continue operations for as long as necessary. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin declared, "The South China Sea is not China's private lake. International law will be upheld." For Beijing, the propaganda machine worked overtime. State TV broadcast footage of Chinese jets roaring overhead and Coast Guard cutters circling the shoal, framing the standoff as proof of Chinese resolve. But analysts pointed out the deeper truth. Beijing had been forced into this confrontation by its own blunder. The collision of June 23rd was still etched into global memory, and no amount of censorship could erase the humiliation. Meanwhile, allies began to weigh in. Japan's Ministry of Defense announced that maritime self-defense force ships would increase patrols in the East China Sea. Australia issued a sharp statement warning against dangerous and destabilizing maneuvers. Even NATO headquarters in Brussels released a note of concern, highlighting that global trade, worth $3.4 trillion annually, depends on free passage through these waters. By evening, military analysts delivered their verdict. This was the most serious escalation in the South China Sea in more than a decade. The risk of miscalculation was higher than ever. A single missile lock, a single collision, or a single reckless pilot could unleash a conflict no one truly wanted. As the sun set on June 27th, the shoal remained contested, the warships still staring at one another across the waves. Diplomats scrambled for solutions. Generals sharpened contingency plans, and the world waited. One question lingered in every mind. Would this end with diplomacy or with fire?